at its core, it's a physical condition. Would a person who with diabetes, and they say, or with asthma, like, oh, I shouldn't need the inhaler, I shouldn't need the insulin, I should just get over this. It's my fault. It's like, no, you don't experience those things all the time, but when they happen, you treat them as a physiological thing that you need help with. It's the same thing in stuttering. Just because it's not consistent, it makes it no less physical.
Welcome to Some Stutter Law, Newfoundland Labrador's first podcast about stuttering. My name is Greg O'Grady, and I am a person who stutters and a co-host of Some Stutter Law, Newfoundland Labrador's first podcast about stuttering, along with my co-host.
And I'm Katelyn Mayo. I'm a future speech-language pathology student, and I'm Greg's co-host on this podcast.
Some Stutter Law mission is dismantling and rebuilding stuttering. Let's start listening. Some Stutter Law mandate is in the spirit of Newfoundland and Labrador's humor, robust and frank interactive discussions. Some Stutter Law podcast aims to rebuild confidence and hope for today's and tomorrow's person who happen to stutter by dismantling the stuttering myths, stigma, stereotypes, and barriers.
The objectives of Some Stutter Law podcast are supporting, raising awareness, and increasing understanding and acceptance of stuttering, providing people who stutter, their families, professionals, students, and the general public with current information, research, and resources about stuttering, and promoting advocacy and support for people who stutter.
Today, Some Stutter Law welcomes Dr. Michael Boyle.
Dr. Boyle is a clinical speech-language pathologist and an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Montclair State University in the United States, where he teaches graduate courses in fluency disorders and directs the Fluency Disorders Laboratory. He is an influential researcher in the field of stuttering and speech-language pathology and researches psychosocial impacts of stuttering, including public and self-stigma. Dr. Boyle's research also focuses on identifying predictors of well-being and communicative participation in people who stutter. And we are very excited to have Dr. Boyle on the podcast today. He's one of my favorite researchers, and I know my friends and I have read so much of his work, and so we are very excited to have you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, so if you want to get us started off, you can introduce yourself a little bit in a less formal way than the little introduction I just read, and maybe kind of share where your interest in this research comes from.
Sure. So I guess the easiest and quickest answer to that is that I'm a person who stutters myself, and so I've lived with it. I've experienced it from when I was very young, and it had a pretty big impact on my life growing up, especially as a child throughout school. And I thought about it a lot throughout the early part of my life, and I still do, obviously, since that's my line of work. But I think there was a really negative impact earlier in life. And so I think there was just something in me that wanted to get into the field because I knew how big of a problem it could be for people. And I wanted to, in some way, help other people who might be going through that same problem, hopefully to make things easier for them in some way, to maybe use things that I had learned or things that I could contribute to maybe make the burden less for other people who are dealing with similar circumstances. So I think that's really what motivated me to get into the field. But then, of course, once I got into my clinical training in graduate school, I realized that, stuttering is obviously not the only communication disorder out there. And there's a lot of other communication disorders that affect all different types of people of all ages. And I was really fascinated by that. There's a common thread. And even though I thought my experience was so unique, and I think in some ways stuttering is kind of unique. I think that's true, but in a lot of ways there's a common thread with a lot of other conditions out there. And the common thread is, you feel held back. You feel like you can't do what you want to do because you have a particular condition, and it can often hold you back, stop you from pursuing your goals, make you feel bad about yourself. and what you can accomplish and what your potential is. And so I just really became immersed in the field and really have enjoyed it. It's been a great ride so far, and really enjoy what I do.
That's awesome. So a lot of your work focuses on kind of stigma reduction and I guess public awareness. There's self-stigma as well, which we'll talk about. But a lot of obviously what we do on this podcast is talk about dismantling stigma and stereotypes and things like that for the public. And I was just wondering, as an individual who stutters and as a very well-informed researcher, what do you think are some of the most effective tools for spreading awareness and reducing stigma?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done, and I've written a lot about this and gotten, I've looked at a lot of literature in the area of psychology, particularly in mental illness, which is another very stigmatized, sort of not very understood condition in our society. And I can speak in particular about the United States. I'm not sure what it's like in Canada, but here people feel kind of embarrassed about talking about it sometimes. So I looked into that literature to get ideas for the work that I've done in stuttering. And there's a few approaches that I've written about. One is education. So just informing people about the facts about stuttering. And often what's helpful there is to actually contrast the facts that we know based on scientific research with the myth. So for example, people who stutter are, inherently more nervous or something like that. It's like, well, it's not true. They're not born that way. And we show the scientific data that would support that, or that it's contagious or something, and then we present that and say, that's not true. These are the facts, or that it's a symbol that a person is less competent or something like that. And we say that's not true. People who stutter can be incredibly successful in all areas of life. As I'm sure that in the US, we have a new president now, Joe Biden, who stutters. He had a childhood history of pretty severe stuttering. He still stutters a bit. It's not as noticeable now, but it's there still to a certain extent. And I think that's an incredibly powerful, empowering message for a lot of the kids out there, that you can stutter and be president of the United States. So there's a lot of hopeful messages out there. So that's one realm, the kind of education realm, which is just more neutral and presenting the facts and so on. Another one is protest, which is more reactive in nature, and it's a little bit more of a tone of kind of standing up for your rights and so on and so forth. So for example, like if in the media somebody says something negative about stuttering, or on a TV show, or it's presented negatively, you could push back against that. And very often, like we have organizations here in the US, like the National Stuttering Association, Friends, the Stuttering Foundation, even the American Speech Language Hearing Association, which might, for example, issue press releases and kind of condemning that behavior and saying it's not right, it's not appropriate, it can have a negative impact, and you shouldn't do that anymore, basically. So there's a pushback against the negative public reaction to let people know this is not okay, and it's not appropriate, and if you do it, you're going to get called out. And so that's one other approach. And then the other approach is just interpersonal contact. And this might be, according to my research anyway, this might be the most powerful approach. And this is just where people who stutter go out into the public, or they give a talk or a presentation, or just in any way they're interacting with other people in the community, in the public, and they're educating them in a sense, but they're also just sharing their life experience as somebody who stutters, saying, this is stuttering, this is what I've had to deal with, this is the challenge of it. But this is also what's possible. And even though it's hard, I can still live my life well. And I speak a lot and I do different things, and it doesn't have to hold you back. It's very challenging, but you can persevere and so on and so forth. So there's that sort of thing. And there's a lot more that I could get into about kind of like what are the evidence-based approaches for disclosing and for spreading that, because there's a good way of doing it and a way of doing it that might not be so helpful, which we could get into if you want. But I think in general, it's education, it's protest or kind of, pushing back on negative treatment, and it's also interpersonal contact and exchanges with the community. So those are a few of the big ones that I've been looking at.
And on the topic of stigma, we talk a lot about the, awareness piece of public stigma, but a lot less about self-stigma, which is another thing that you've done a lot of work on. And you've developed the Self-Stigma of Stuttering Scale, which is really cool. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I, again, that was modeled after something I read about in the psychology literature. There's a researcher named Patrick Corrigan who focuses in stigma in mental illness. And so I use basically he and his colleagues had this model of self-stigma. And I thought, that's really interesting. And to my knowledge, nothing in the area of stuttering actually covers this, where you can have one scale that measures the, different levels of self-stigma. So in general, self-stigma is, it's a little bit complicated to, talk about stigma because it's such a broad concept and there's a lot of pieces to it. But in general, self-stigma is the internalization of negative societal attitudes and reactions to stuttering. So the idea is you live with stuttering, you experience over time this accumulation of negative reactions. Like people might look at you funny or ask, why do you talk like that? Or they might mimic you, or they might sort of maybe avoid you or think that you're different or something like that. And the idea is that over time, a person who stutters becomes aware of that negative reaction. And especially the more it happens, they begin to anticipate it. So they're afraid of it happening again. They might feel it in terms of feeling embarrassed or ashamed of it. They might even begin to agree with it and say, yeah, people who stutter are more nervous, or they are less competent, or they are weird or strange or something like that. And then the ultimate step, or the last sort of step in this theoretical model, is that they apply it to themselves personally. So the idea is like, yeah, I stutter, therefore I am strange. I am not as worthy. I am less competent. I am not as confident, things like that. And then I guess the kind of ultimate endpoint of that is that you start to say, okay, well, why even bother? Why try to get that job that requires a lot of talking? I stutter, I can't do that. Why? Yeah, I want to go up to this person at this party and introduce myself, but I stutter, I can't do that. And over time, enough of those experiences build up where even if in the moment it seems small, all those things of holding yourself back, and it's almost like you can think of it like self-discrimination, where it's like, I stutter, therefore I'm going to hold myself back. I'm going to keep myself on the sidelines and therefore not really do what I want to do in life. And then you end up years down the road, unfortunately, with a lot of people who stutter who have lived a life that they don't want to live, or they'd rather be doing something else, but they chose their current career because they didn't have to talk that much, or they chose their major in school because they knew that they wouldn't have to give a lot of presentations or something like that. So it ends up, all these things end up getting stacked on top of each other until one day it really just consumes life in general. Now, not every person who stutters does that, by the way. There are people who don't for, various reasons. And this is also a part of what I've been looking at in my research, they're aware of it, but they don't agree with it. They don't internalize it. So not everybody who stutters, who's aware of those negative stereotypes and negative attitudes, ends up applying it to themselves. So that's a good thing. But there are a substantial amount of people who stutter who do. And that's a really big problem. And so that's what a lot of my research has been doing. And the scale, as you mentioned, the Self-Stigma of Stuttering Scale, which has now been translated into more than 10 languages, and it's being used by researchers and clinicians all over the world. And it's a tool to be able to measure awareness, agreement, and application. So the 3 A's: awareness, agreement, and application. It's a scale that can do that. And it's the only scale really that measures it according to that theoretical model. There's a lot of scales out there in speech language pathology that measure the psychosocial impacts of stuttering, but this was the first one that actually took a theoretical model of self-stigma and adapted it specifically for people who stutter.
Just out of curiosity, my own curiosity, what are some ways you think that, I guess, clinicians, professionals, speech language pathologists, counselors, psychologists, anybody can benefit from using this scale in treatment? And
right. Yeah, so I guess the idea with it in clinic would be, and I have to say, I mean, I designed it originally as more of a research question. I didn't know that it would become a clinical tool necessarily, although I mean, after it was published, a lot of clinicians expressed a lot of interest in it, and so it became that. But when I first designed it, it was more just to answer a research question that I was curious about. I wanted to look at, the comparison of awareness, agreement, and application to see what the mixture was, like, were people aware of it but didn't agree with it? Did they? So I wanted to look at that, but then it became a clinical thing. And I guess the idea with it in clinic is that you could use it, a clinician could use it with a client if they, as a part of a larger, testing protocol, obviously, if they suspected that self-stigma might be relevant for this person, and they might look at those levels of stigma in terms of awareness, agreement, application. And if those things were a problem, especially the agreement and application piece, because you could be aware of it without it impacting you personally. So especially agreement and application, you could potentially test those to see, okay, does this client have some negative beliefs that are going to hold them back in therapy if they're not addressed, specifically regarding stigma and stereotypical views about people who stutter? And if they do have high scores in those areas, you could potentially do some cognitive therapy to educate them about stuttering, to kind of bust those myths about the stereotypes and things like that, and to work on things like self-esteem and, assertiveness and all those kinds of things, so that people can reclaim their power, so to speak, and to not give into those negative views, and not to accept the societal view that, oh, people who stutter, maybe they shouldn't do this job that requires a lot of talking. Maybe they can't, and you educate people about that, and about how you can do what you want to do. And that's the goal, and to change their attitude about it. And in terms of the awareness part, which is actually the first section of the scale, in the long term, it might be a really interesting thing to look at. This is what I think anyway, is to monitor the levels of awareness. Because even though it's true that a person can be aware of negative societal views and not internalize it, ideally, I think over time, it would be great to see as a long-term goal that awareness reduces, because ultimately it would be nice if the societal views improved over time, which is our goal. And so we can track this now with the data that we have, and the more that we do it in the future, we can look at those levels to see if it goes down as a result of the advocacy work that, people like you and people like various organizations are doing. So that would be another potential use for the scale on the public side of it as well.
Sure. I'm going to ask one more quick question before I let Greg ask a question, because I just have such a big list of questions. So sort of on that note, speaking about clinical speech language pathologists, I found it really cool, the work you did looking at the perceived self-efficacy of speech language pathologists in conducting like the multidimensional approach and bringing kind of the psychosocial factors and things like that. And I've thought a lot about this. And one thing that I ask people is if they think that SLPs are equipped to take on the full scope of these psychosocial and emotional components of stuttering treatment, or is there more training that's required?
It's a great question, and it's one that I get a lot, and a lot of my colleagues get that a lot as well. And it's kind of a perennial topic in the area of stuttering. It seems like it keeps coming up, like decade after decade. Even though I think we've made a lot of progress in general, there's still a lot of work to be done. But yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think that definitely, speech language pathologists do counseling. That's my belief, is that it's hard. You can't really separate the work that we do from counseling. It's true, we're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists, we're not social workers, we are speech language pathologists. But, there are things that you can learn about counseling. There are things that you can learn about cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, acceptance and commitment therapy. There are things that a clinician can learn that they can use in therapy that could be really beneficial. And, we're not saying that we're psychologists, but I don't see how you can really separate, like if somebody has a disorder or a condition that makes them feel bad in social situations and personally in terms of emotions and thoughts, I don't see how you can separate that from the physical domain, because some people would say, for example, well, we're speech language pathologists, so aren't we not, we're not trained to talk about thoughts and feelings and things like that. And it's like, hopefully you are, and you should be, because these are things that you're going to deal with as a professional. And if you don't know how to deal with them, you're going to be a lot less effective than you could be. And that's just, I think that's very, very obvious. You have to know the sort of hidden side of it. You have to know the internal piece and how to respond to it. Because, for example, some people say, well, this sounds like it's getting into like the psychologist territory. A psychologist could be helpful for some people who stutter if they're dealing with bigger life issues and stresses, and if it gets to a level of life impact where the SLP feels like this is really outside of my expertise. But we have to realize too, I think, that most psychologists don't know very much about stuttering. So they know about, for example, various cognitive therapies and so on, but they don't know as much about stuttering as a speech language pathologist does. So it would be beneficial for speech language pathologists who are trained and educated in stuttering to, I think, know also about some of the counseling stuff, because that would just help them in so many ways. So yeah, I think it's critically important. I think that more and more SLPs are learning that over time. And I think we're in a better place than we were a few decades ago, where it was really more behavioral work. But there's a lot to be done, because a lot of people still feel, they might know it at the intellectual level, that, yeah, it's important to deal with reactions, or it's important to deal with these things, thoughts and feelings and social dynamics, but they don't know how to do it sometimes, or they don't know how to write a goal for it. They don't know how to measure that progress. So until they really know how to do it in terms of assessing that stuff in therapy and treating it, it's just going to be another thing where they say, well, yeah, that sounds great and I should be doing it, but I don't know how to do it. So I'll default to slow rate and easy onsets or something like that, So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think it's better than it has been in the past. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's a complicated topic.
absolutely. That seems to be what I've heard, because I feel very strongly about incorporating counseling techniques into speech therapy. That's kind of my whole plan for when I go to grad school. And one of the things I've heard from people is they want to be able to do this, but they don't have time to learn about these counseling techniques and these things. They don't feel that they are equipped to take on this role. And so I have big dreams of being that person that builds that bridge between counseling and psychology, and I do a master's in counseling psychology as well, and kind of bring it all together. So
Great. Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, there are, partnerships between SLPs and counselors and psychologists. There's a few programs in the US anyway that kind of, they kind of work in tandem and cooperate. And I think the big thing, as you said, is it would be ideal perhaps to have a partnership, right? Because then you're not just saying, okay, well, this is getting into psychological territory, so I'm going to just automatically refer to a psychologist, because you would ideally, I think, want to know that psychologist or that counselor and know that they know about stuttering, so that you can be aligned in terms of the goals that you're working on, to make sure, for example, that the psychologist isn't doing something that's in opposition to what you're doing in therapy and so on. So I think it would be ideal to have that collaborative relationship where there are bridges built, as you said, between those professions, to make sure that that you're on the same page. So
absolutely,
that sounds
yeah.
great.
I talk to every single researcher, speech language pathologist I ever meet. I bring up this idea of collaborative work because I think it's so important.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to take a second and see if Greg has a question, because I've been asking more questions than I normally do.
Oh, I mean, that's good, Katelyn. Doctor, I mean, listen, listening to you, talking about the the mental health component of stuttering. Sometimes I feel, I had lived, I really identify with the things you have been saying, because for me, for many years, I had lived my life as a covert stutterer, and so I used to avoid certain social situations, and like the old tricks of the trade, asking families to make appointments, and just you know, you know, not wanting to go, to introduce myself. So all of the word substitutions. But sometimes I feel is well I do feel strongly that people who stutter do not have a strong understanding understanding about the emotional impact stuttering can have on one's emotional and personal life. And so and so I think a lot of the reason is that many people who stutter, as you mentioned, are very embarrassed, they're very ashamed. We tend to hide our stuttering, but unfortunately it has long lasting effects mentally, and but I mean, to make a long story short, what would your advice be to a person who stutters to really try to take notice and to try to understand what's going on inside, and how to deal with it, the emotional component?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a complicated one, because I think that for a lot of people who stutter, and this kind of touches on some of the research that I've been doing with a colleague of mine named Dr. Rod Gobble, who is he's been in the field for a long time, and we've done a few projects recently where we have interviewed people who stutter who are now adults, but we're kind of looking back on their journey, basically from being more concealed to being more open. And, what we really found is that it's, for most people anyway, it's a process of kind of learning how to cope with it. And at first, and maybe earlier in life, it's kind of like, what is this? What's wrong with me? Why am I different from other people? And there's kind of this, and also they get reacted to, by other people negatively, and they internalize that. It kind of relates to the whole stigma piece that we talked about before. But then over time, what seemed to be the kind of common elements that everybody shared. Not everybody has the same path, obviously, and not everybody has the same endpoint. Everybody's story is different in some way, but there are some things that appear to be in common. And one of them is that they got help, but good help, help from people who knew about stuttering. So whether that be speech language pathologists who really understood it, and they understood, as you said earlier, Katelyn, about the emotional, social pieces. If they get that, very often they feel like they're really being helped, as opposed to, oh, you stutter, just use these strategies and you'll be good to go. And it's like, for a lot of people, that just doesn't happen. They end up feeling worse about themselves because it's like there's a blame piece to it. Like, what's wrong with me that I can't do what they're telling me to do? So you get good help from people who know what they're doing. Unfortunately, there aren't as many of those as we'd like, but that's the first thing. It doesn't always have to be professional help either. There's a lot of self-help and support out there for stuttering. Like in the United States, for example, there's, as I said before, the National Stuttering Association, Friends, which is the association for young people who stutter. And there's self-help groups and meetings. And especially during COVID, there's been web versions of that where everybody's getting together online, and they're not professionals necessarily, but you're meeting other people who share a similar path. And just that can make you feel better. Talking about it with other people who understand can be huge. A lot of people who suffer with this, in my experience, and I'm one of them, grew up really not talking with other people who stutter. And you kind of feel like you're the only one going through it. So being able to talk to somebody, incredibly important. And just through that, you sort of, a lot of people can think about it differently over time, where you start to sort of notice, okay, how do I feel about this? Is it holding me back in life from things like, so like, as an example, you're in school, you're in class, and you're like, you want to say something, but you don't want to raise your hand because you say, well, I stutter, so it's going to be hard, it's going to stop the class, it's going to slow, everything down. You start to sort of notice, and this is what you can get help from this in therapy too, by the way, because you need somebody, I think, to bounce ideas off of and to share these experiences, and they can sort of challenge you a bit to say, okay, well, why couldn't you raise your hand? Why couldn't you say what you want to say? Well, I stutter, I can't. Well, yeah, but isn't that sort of thinking about it in a way that's like your voice isn't as important? And you start to think, okay, well, yeah, maybe that. And you start to challenge all these presuppositions that you have about, well, I stutter, I can't do that. And you need somebody very often who can challenge you on those beliefs. And that's the value of a lot of these groups. And, frankly, what you're doing here on your podcast and various other podcasts and stuttering is that you're providing models of people who stutter, who are communicating openly and not having it hold them back. So I just think everybody's different. It's a journey, it's a process. It sounds cliche, but it's true. And it's a process of kind of coping with it, learning how to deal with it. Very often people start in a place where they're struggling with it, they don't like it. Eventually, a lot of people come to accept it, even, as I'm sure that you are aware of, I think, in the US anyway, there's a big push right now for pride and for being, is not just acceptance, it's kind of beyond acceptance. It's like, this is who we are, this is how I talk. And there's really no effort to even try to change speech necessarily. So there's a whole movement of that going on as well, which is more of the advocacy sort of social model movement that's kind of gaining some momentum in certain areas of the field. It's not, there's some pushback to it. And we can talk about that if you want to, but there's a growing wing of the field that is more, I would say, almost radically different from what's come before in terms of like, look, this is how it is and accept it, and that's it. And so yeah, so anyway, it's a tough question, but I hope those are some ideas that can maybe give some answers.
Yeah. You know, I'm wondering as well, doctor, that when a person who stutters, decides to seek treatment, okay, so the person goes to see a speech language pathologist. Now, like how does one, or what would be the appropriate way to address the emotional component of stuttering? Because I feel that to fully appreciate and benefit from the speech therapy, you really need to understand the emotional component. Now, now I feel that this this is a very delicate area when someone's going to a speech pathologist, and so so I'm just wondering, is it the responsibility of the speech language pathologist to address it, to identify it, to help the person who stutters understand the emotional component? And I'm just wondering the possible follow-up component. Would a person who stutters be ready to accept that? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I think, everybody is different, and there are different stages of perhaps, dealing with it. Like, for example, early in my life, when I was young, I didn't want to hear anything about meeting other people who stutter or doing any of that. I was very much, I think, Greg, like you, I was very concealing about it. I tried to hide it a lot. So for whatever reason, I was not, I didn't think at that point in life anyway, ready to do a lot of that stuff. I wanted it to go away. So, and I think a lot of people deal with that. And that's entirely rational and reasonable. You have a speaking condition where it's variable. You lose control of your body at unpredictable times in front of other people. It's not exactly a pleasant experience in my judgment. You can come to a point out, I think, over time where you think about it differently. But my experience anyway growing up was I didn't like it, and I still sometimes don't like it. And so I still have to work on this, in terms of being okay with it. Some people aren't like that, and they're more open about it. But so I think it's hard. That's a tough question because everybody is so different. It depends. Like some people who stutter don't really have the emotional piece. They just might stutter a lot and they don't really care. And, and so their therapy might really be more focused on the speech part of it because they keep talking, it doesn't hold them back, but their teachers or their parents say, it'd be great if they could speak a little bit more easily and not have to struggle so much. In that case, it's legitimate completely to focus a lot more on the speech domain, right? Because they don't need a lot of help with the emotional piece. You might have some of it just to prevent it from happening in the future, but that's very different from someone who has a lot of shame, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, or somebody who's hiding it a lot, right? So if they're hiding it a lot, that's a whole different thing. And then you would really need to get into the internal part of it because on the surface, they're not really showing much of it, but they're very much impacted by it. So I think it's sort of a case by case thing, and you kind of approach it differently for different kinds of clients. There's not just, I don't think, one way of doing it. It really depends on the person and their unique situation. But I mean, if there was one, and there's so much that could be said about this, Greg, it could be, I mean, it's impossible to, summarize all that you could do in the emotional realm and how to do that. But I guess one thing to kind of take from it is, if you're working, for example, with a kid or somebody who stutters and who may feel badly about it, one of the things I think is so important as a core message is that it's okay to stutter. And just conveying that, because it sounds so simple, but I can tell you from my own experience that that's not a message that I got in therapy. It was all about, okay, you stutter, let's get rid of it. And therefore the message, if you already feel bad about it, like I did, you internalize that as, yeah, stuttering is bad and fluency is good. And therefore, if you hide it, it snowballs. That hiding, it actually feeds into the concealment if you're being taught how to be fluent all the time. So the fluency strategies that you learn can be used as an avoidance, mechanism. It's not true for everybody, but for people who have a tendency to avoid and feel bad about it. So in that case, one of the most powerful things that can be conveyed to a client is just an open, accepting, it's okay to stutter here. You can be open about it. I want you to be open. I want you to show me what your stuttering is like. And we can investigate it. We can look at it. We can see what it's like. We can sort of play with it a bit, even in therapy, and maybe even eventually make friends with it, even if that sounds strange to somebody who would say, are you crazy? I don't want to make friends with it. But over time, maybe that's a possibility. And, for some people, they're just not ready, as you said, Greg. I mean, I wasn't, but the idea is, I think sometimes as clinicians, we plant seeds that don't always bear fruit right away, but it's a message that hopefully resonates with them, so that even if they don't show a whole lot of progress in the short term that we might want to see, they're exposed to somebody in their life who says, you're okay as you are. And yes, we can do things to help you. We can do things to make you feel like you can speak more easily, if that's an important goal to you, if that would help you. But at your core, you are okay as you are, as a person who stutters. It's nothing to be ashamed about. It doesn't make you less than. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you weird. This is just a condition that some people deal with, and we can help and we can make it easier. But I think just that message, if I had, and I think if a lot of people had maybe heard that, or not even heard it, but just had that conveyed to them in an accepting environment, I think that would be a good start. And of course, there's a lot more that you could do in therapy to work on that, all sorts of strategies and goals, and a lot has been written on this. But I think at its core, if there's one message to kind of take away from it, it's stuttering is okay. And once you allow for that, everything else kind of opens up, like, as opposed to looking at it like, this is the right way to talk, this is the wrong way to talk, it's too binary. It's too much of an oversimplification for a condition that's as complex as stuttering is, to just say, okay, well, use these tools and stop doing it. It doesn't really work that way. So if we can teach people that, then we have a lot more room to work, and we have a lot more possibilities for what successful treatment could mean. So,
like we all know that stuttering is fluid. As a person who stutters, I have my good days, I got my bad days, and I have my train wreck speaking experiences, bad days. But what would be your advice to people who stutter that do have a train wreck speaking experience? The tendency for the person who stutters is to get depressed, get frustrated, angry, things like that. But the anger is really directed within internally, and so I think it's important for people to stutter, to really take a step back and try to see things in perspective. What advice would you give, Doctor?
it's a great question, Greg, and I'm glad that you asked that, because I see that a lot as well. I used to live that. I still do sometimes, actually, in terms of you have a bad day. Everybody who stutters knows that experience, right? Some days are just for whatever, and we don't know exactly why. Maybe you're tired, you're sick, you're stressed, you're whatever. It exacerbates it in some way, right? And sometimes I actually experience the opposite, where where I'm very relaxed and I get very disfluent. I experience it a lot actually after the semester is over at the end of each academic year and I'm not teaching anymore. I'll notice for about a month and a half after that, my speech is very, very disfluent. And I used to get down on myself about that in terms of like, well, I should be able to, I know about stuttering and fluency. I should be able to keep it consistent. I've eventually learned that, to just sort of roll with it and to just accept that this is stuttering. The only constant about it is variability, which is kind of a paradox, but it's true. And but the important thing is, because I think, again, this kind of gets back to the whole self-stigma piece in a way. A lot of us internalize this idea that we've heard from adults when we were growing up or from therapists that, okay, well, there are things you could do to stop doing this. And so therefore, if you're stuttering, the blame is kind of on you. And so I think that sets a lot of people up for feeling negatively, as you said, Greg, about that, in terms of if there's a day where you're having more difficulty and you're stuttering more, you tend to blame yourself. Like, what's wrong with me that I can't get a hold of this today? What I would say is just have self-compassion and the understanding that this is a physical condition. At its core, it's a physical condition. Would a person who, with diabetes, and they say, or with asthma, like, oh, I shouldn't need the inhaler. I shouldn't need the insulin, I should just get over this. It's my fault. It's like, no, you don't experience those things all the time, but when they happen, you treat them as a physiological thing that you need help with. It's the same thing in stuttering. Just because it's not consistent, it makes it no less physical. I think a lot of people get confused about that because they see how variable it is. And they say, well, you could do it in therapy. Why can't you do it all the rest of the time? It's like, just because it's variable, it doesn't mean it's not physical. And I think a lot of people who I see this a lot, by the way, on message boards, on Facebook. I see people who stutter write this a lot. They say, I had a really bad day. I mean, it's got to be psychological, right? Because I was fluent yesterday. So, and I'm not today. It's got to be something in my mind. And I occasionally, if I see posts like that, I'll write back and say, it's a physical thing. I'll use the analogy of asthma or diabetes. It's no less physical. All the research in stuttering points to, at its core, it's a largely genetically transmitted neurophysiological condition. This is not something you're choosing to do. This is not, oh, just get over it. And, it's like, that's not what stuttering is. So we need to first be aware of that and have some self-compassion for, like, this is hard to live with sometimes. And that's why the only downside, I think, to a lot of the, I don't know if you call it downside, but a counter argument you could make to a lot of the pride stuff, as good as it is, and as much as we can gain from it, is that I worry that it could invalidate people from feeling bad about stuttering. Because, yeah, there's a right to feel bad about stuttering. It's a hard thing to live with. So let's make room for that and acknowledge it. And so I guess I would just say, Greg, I know it's kind of a long answer and kind of like meandering a bit, but the understanding that it is a physical condition that you should have self-compassion for. This is a hard thing to live with, and some days it's going to be harder than others. And as opposed to what's wrong with me that I can't get a hold of this, just saying, I'm stuttering a lot right now. Not saying it's a bad day, not saying my speech is bad right now, but just objectively, neutrally observing, I'm stuttering a lot today. I'm having some trouble getting speech out today. It's a more difficult speech day, but it doesn't make it bad. It doesn't make it bad, and it doesn't make you less than because you're having it. It's just It's more difficult today because you stutter. And sometimes you have days that are more difficult, and that is completely normal and natural. So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I have loved listening to everything you've had to say. I honestly wish I could ask like 70 more questions. My list is so long, but I think maybe we should start to conclude up. I have one final question. I think it'll be a good note to go out on. Just wondering, with all the work that you do as a professor teaching students who are going to become SLPs and all of your research that you do, what has been the most rewarding aspect of that for you?
That's a great question. I can think of some recent examples in class over the past year where it can put people on a trajectory, I think, that they didn't know that they were interested in. You know, they don't know a lot about stuttering, most of the students, when they come into the class, and just the learning about the complexities of it, right? Even before we get to assessment and treatment, there's a lot on just understanding stuttering. A lot of what we just talked about, physical, variable, loss of control, all those fundamentals that if you don't understand them, nothing else is really going to make sense, because you'll just do what you're told, like, oh, I have to do this because this is what I learned about, but you don't really understand it. So I think people need to understand it. And so with that framework, the assessment and the treatment that we talk about makes a lot of sense, just intuitively, once they understand the depths of it and the layers of it and the complexity of it. And so I guess I would just say that it's really rewarding to see people get inspired by it. I also think that it resonates with some people. I think in some ways, like the stuff that we talk about in stuttering is a microcosm or an analogy for a lot of what people in life deal with a lot of different stuff. Even though stuttering is its own thing, the idea of shame and acceptance and transcendence, these are universal things that a lot of people, that everybody has something about them that they don't like or that they might feel shameful about. And I feel like the things that they learn in the class resonate with them on a level that goes beyond stuttering, and they learn things that are like tools that can help them in their own life in some way. And so that's really rewarding. And just the idea that there aren't, frankly, a lot of people in the field, at least in the US, who specialize in stuttering. And so this can set you apart. Like if you put the work in and you really try to learn about stuttering and have empathy for people who stutter and learn what they go through. And, yes, it takes some time. It takes some reading, maybe it takes some like listening to podcasts like this, but it can be done. It just takes some time. It takes some effort. It takes the desire to want to do it. You can really learn about it, and you could make a big difference in people who stutterers' lives. I think the idea that they get into the field, most of them, I think, because they want to help people. They see people struggling. They want to help people. And this is something where you can really help people. And it goes beyond just the speech domain. You could really do things that end up changing the course of somebody's life. And the idea that you're the person who knows about stuttering and you have this knowledge where once you interact with the client, that that's a sacred space where they're not getting that probably with anybody else in their lives. And so even if it's a half hour a week, an hour a week, that space is unique for that person. They're getting something from you that they don't get from anybody else. And it's a really incredibly powerful thing. And you get the sense that you can really help people and change their life. I mean, I've been affected by it just in my own experience. And many people who get into the field have those experiences where they are, are touched by a mentor or, teacher, somebody who kind of opens the door and says, look, it can be this way. And then everything changes, and that person goes on to do a lot of great things. And so it's like a cycle and it just keeps going. And so I guess it's just, that's the thing that just kind of keeps me inspired, is that even if there's a handful of people in any group that are going to really resonate with it, it makes it worth it, and it makes it fulfilling in the idea to keep going, because you never know who you're going to impact. Even people who don't tell you, right? Like at the time, even if you don't know, very often we're impacted by what people say or do, and and they don't know that. And I feel like teaching is that as well. You really don't know all the time the impact that you might be having, but I think it's just a very, very valuable thing. And people who stutter need it. They need people in the field who are professionals who know about stuttering. So it's necessary to help people. And so it's very rewarding to be, educating people who are just about to set off on their journey. And it kind of makes them feel like, yes, I chose the right field. This is for me. I really feel a lot of passion about this. And once you can get somebody in an emotional place where it's not just learning about facts about something, it's that they feel inspired to do something, that sticks with you for life.
Yeah, just hearing, every time I hear someone in the field talk about it, just makes me so much more excited to start my program, and like just makes me feel like I've chose the right career. And so it's just really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Dr. Mostly, Katelyn, I have lots of questions to ask you, but my last question, doctor, like I had read somewhere that that grief is often associated with stuttering. It's a loss, an eternal loss of fluency, and this article I read compared it to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. Do you think that there's any truth to this, or have you heard this before?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that kind of touches on a little bit of what I was mentioning earlier about the research with Rod Gobble, in terms of how people progress over their lives, in terms of starting out in a place of they feel different, they feel maybe ashamed, they feel weird, and very often they want to just be normal like everybody else, like quote unquote normal, right? So they go through a process very often of trying to do that, and then very often get to a point where it's like they learn through whatever means that this is how I am. I mean, I can't be that. This is really who I am. And there's an acceptance process. And so I guess, yeah, like the grief, stages that you mentioned, I think it's not necessarily identical for every person. And I don't think it's linear for every single person in the same way. But I think in general, that stage model of like, in general, going from more negative to more accepting, and then perhaps transcending that to be more positive, I think a lot of people do experience that. And it's fluid, it's not like, okay, I was upset about it and now I'm just completely fine with it forever and I never feel bad about it again. Like the boundaries are a bit fluid, and some people sort of go back and forth a bit and, vacillate a bit, and maybe they, I don't know if you'd use the word regress, or just they change how they look at it. I mean, I've experienced that, where I think I've come to a really accepting place with my stuttering, and then something happens where I realized that, whoa, actually I'm not as accepting of it as I thought I was, because I felt really bad in that situation where I got into a stutter and people noticed it or something like that. So it kind of comes and goes in waves, but I think over time, the overarching process is more accepting, more positive. And ordinarily how you arrive at that is you change what you do and you change how you perceive it. If I could just be really simple about it, is to get to that place of more negativity and being closed off about it to more positivity and being open about it, is you do things that you didn't do before. Maybe you're more open about it. you talk to people about it, you take risks that you never, had before, then you also think about it differently. Like, hey, this is a part of who I am. This doesn't make me a bad person or less than, this is, so you change what you do and you change how you look at it. And those things kind of go hand in hand and they impact each other. The more you do things that you didn't think you could do, the more that affects your psychology. And the more that you think about things differently in terms of reframing them, right? Like, I thought this was really terrible. Maybe it's not so terrible. Maybe it's this way. Maybe I can look at it differently. The more that then changes what you do. So the thought process and the behavior kind of go hand in hand, and I think they reinforce each other. So long term, I think that is a trajectory from being more concealed and more shut off to being more open about it, that a lot of people do experience. But there are challenges. It's not easy, and you kind of have to be a bit vigilant, because it is easy, from my experience, to kind of slide into behaviors or ways of thinking that aren't necessarily ideal. And so it's not just something that you just do once and you say, okay, I'm done with this. Now I can be happy with it forever. You kind of have to check back in with yourself to make sure that you're doing the work and that you're being open about it and accepting of it, and being self-compassionate too, and not getting down on yourself, and having a healthy mindset about it as well. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Well, thanks a lot, Doctor, for joining us today. And Katelyn and I both learned a lot, and I'm sure that our listeners will really sort of benefit from listening to this as well. And so we will have you back for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you very much again. There's a lot to discuss, obviously, and thanks for the work that you're doing in terms of advocacy and spreading public awareness as well. It was a pleasure meeting you and talking with you, and yeah, I hope to come back at a later date.
Yes, thank you so much. I hope people listening can sense the excitement in my voice this whole episode. I'm just so happy I was able to chat with you and ask these questions.
Great. Well, it's been really fun for me too. Thanks a lot.
Some Stutter La, Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast about stuttering, has so much to talk about. Let's start listening.
This has been an episode of Some Stutter La, Newfoundland and Labrador's first podcast about stuttering. Some Stutter La is hosted and produced by Greg O'Grady, Katelyn Mayo, Emily Murphy, Dr. Paul DeDecker, and Luca Dinu. Some Stutter La is available on Anchor, Spotify, Breaker, Google Podcast, Pocket Cast, and Radio Public. You can also check out the Some Stutter La channel on YouTube. To ask a question, send a comment or suggestion, or to get in touch, find them online at Some Stutter Podcast on Instagram or at Some Stutter La Pod on Facebook. Thanks for listening.